all for coming on a rainy New York day. I just arrived from cold Chicago this morning. So I'm Barbara Ransby. I actually am on the Imagining America board and really believe in and am hopeful for what Imagining America is doing and is growing into. And people like, get to work with people like Ken Masuda and Jan Cohen-Cruz and Nancy Cantor and others, and it's really, in my view, an attempt to push back against a kind of corporatization of the academy, which doesn't value engagement and doesn't value the kind of public projects that a lot of folks around IA are involved in. So what we'd like to do today, we're all from Chicago, so we're Chicago crew here. We even have former Chicagoans who are living in other places who've now come and joined us, like the second row there. We've done work within Chicago. So I'm going to start us off, and we all work together in various capacities in Chicago, which is part of what I want to say as a part of opening up the conversation. I want to say a little bit about who we are, and each of the other panelists is going to talk about the work that we do, and I'll say a little bit about the project that I'm working on. I'm going to say a little bit about how we try to do it. So I am a historian by training, an activist by choice. I've been involved in various kinds of social movements for most of my adult life, which now is quite a long time. And I only recently have really tried to do work inside the academy as a professor, sort of opening up space for social justice kinds of projects. But I'll say more about that in a minute. My main work is I wrote a book on a woman named Ella Baker a number of years ago, and her style of grassroots organizing has inspired me and inspired a lot of other people. And most recently, I've finished a biography of a woman named Aslanda Robeson, who was best known, I guess, as the wife of Paul Robeson. Hopefully she won't continue to be known only in that capacity, but she was an anti-colonial activist and internationalist, and another really amazing life. So let me just say a little bit about the work that's going on in Chicago. Through a constellation of organizations, campaigns, and institutions in Chicago, we are a part of a network that works, writes, rallies, convenes, and imagines around a set of principles, and I want to name a few of those principles. One is that we start from the assumption that there are great and rich reservoirs of knowledge and bastions of creativity outside of the academy and beyond the club of credentialed scholars and researchers, a club to which some of us belong, but to which we don't pledge our unconditional allegiance. Secondly, there's an ethical obligation that comes with the privilege of doing what we do, that is, producing art and ideas for public engagement. And that obligation demands that we understand the political landscape upon which we write, speak, dance, sing, paint, and perform. I only do a couple of those things. But in each of our fields and industries, there are very real and powerful differentials. The power to sanction, publish, patronize, fund, tenure, and endorse. And we have to understand and map the differentials of power in the spaces that we occupy. I think otherwise we're being dishonest about the work that we do. Thirdly, we try not to simply engage in academic or art production, but in what my colleague Tony Bogues describes as the practice of freedom. I'm actually coming from a 3-day symposium on slavery and its aftermath in the Atlantic world. So that idea of the practicing freedom in various forms is very much on my mind. That as intellectuals and artists, we often talk about individual freedom, and certainly that's important. But what we've tried to talk about in the network that we've established in Chicago and beyond is that individual freedom is not enough. We need to talk about the practice of collective freedom. The late and dear Howard Zinn once wrote a small booklet called Artists in a Time of War. And in that he suggests the suspension of peacetime routine and a kind of transcendence of the regular and the ordinary in recognition of moments of crisis. It is a concession to what Dr. King referred to as the fierce urgency of now. But what does it mean to think of every moment as urgent in some way? To defy complacency and conformity, to churn, to uproot, to celebrate debate rather than fear it. I say all this because there's radicalism in the title of this panel, but also we try to embrace this ethos in our work. I want to talk about this radical approach, this notion of fierce urgency of now for practical reasons as well. And I want to go back to the idea of the collective practice of freedom. If we think in terms of we rather than I when we talk about the practice of freedom, if we think broadly and not narrowly, certainly if we think globally and locally, then there is indeed a sense of urgency. It is the urgency of poverty and increasing wealth disparity. It is the urgency of homelessness, aggravated by the recent foreclosure epidemic. It is the urgency of mass incarceration and the insatiable hunger that the prison industrial complex seems to have for black and brown bodies. There's seats up here. Excuse me, young lady, are you registered for the conference? This is my daughter. And her friend. So in other words, and the other sense of urgency, the sense of urgency that I feel enormously is the increasing growth and strength and ominous power of a neoliberal state that has recalibrated what is important, war rather than human beings, and the whole idea of dependency being redefined and pathologized, that to be dependent is a pathology rather than the reality that we're all interdependent. So these are some of some of the understandings, I think, that undergird our work in very, very different places. Some of us working in the academy, some of us doing community organizing, some of us working in the art world, etc. So the question for me also, as someone who has lived most of my professional work, well, I guess all of my professional life, in the academy, is how do we, with humility and savvy, with care and caution, navigate our role, in a sense, as Ella Baker described it, as outsiders within. That is, with insider status, right, but with outsider loyalties, and always not just holding the door open for somebody else to come in, but really questioning why there's so many doors and gates and barriers around particularly our academic spaces and the sites where knowledge production is supposed to be happening, because really we're compromising knowledge production by building those both metaphoric and physical walls. Question of how we leverage resources without compromising mission, how we deal with development and donors without morphing into what they want us to be. And in some cases, how do we survive professionally and protect if we don't always advance our own careers without forfeiting the we for the I. That brings me to the final point that I want to make in this kind of introductory setting the stage, which we've talked about in preparing for this panel, is the whole question of advocacy and activism for those of us who are also academics. And also people working in the nonprofit world, because we're often told to leave your politics at the door, that you're doing either service work or facilitating or teaching as if those come unencumbered from who we are. And it's a particular irony, I think, with a great hubbub about diversity when you say, leave who you are at the door. Or you say to your students, I spent my whole life reading books and trying to understand the world. I really don't have a strong opinion about it. So I think that's being a bad role model rather than a good role model, and that essentially we have to have a lot more courage of purpose in foregrounding a set of ethical values, a set of politics. But we can do that in a way where there's still room for debate and discussion and learning and disagreement and contestation. In fact, that's the only way that we can do it. If we pretend to have a kind of bloodless objectivism, if we pretend to have an ethical agnosticism, then in fact, how do you engage? How does a student then say to me, you believe in this and not this? Why? Because I haven't really been honest about what I believe. I'm just telling you, this is how history was, this is what the sources tell us as a historian, which is really, the sources don't tell us, we interpret the sources. So I think that's a really important debate, that's an important concept, that's an important conversation for us to immerse and engage ourselves in. What does it mean to be an advocate? What does it mean to be an activist in a context, in a culture that pretends and advertises and in fact rewards, you know, a veneer of objectivity. And in fact, I think many people who are scholars are not taken as seriously when they do foreground their activism and their advocacy. And so finding that articulation between advocacy and creating a space for debate and disagreement and learning, I think is really the challenge of engaged scholarship and civic engagement. And I just want to say one quick thing about civic engagement, and I started off saying I love IA and I love many and support, in a lot of ways, many projects that do what's termed civic engagement as a big rubric. But I think we have to be more ambitious than that. I think we have to inject the language of social justice into the conversation and defend it. And I think that's when we get a really robust payoff, and that's when we get to examining some of the really hard questions about the meaning of our work and the impact of our work. You know, I'm prone to say, you know, there have been many civic organizations that I wouldn't support and that haven't advanced, you know, any kind of, you know, the Ku Klux Klan was a civic organization, you know, the Tea Party is a civic organization. So engagement alone doesn't mean that people are collectively trying to contribute to a larger good, right? That's not to say everyone in my end of the political spectrum is always agrees or that we're always right. But I think, you know, there is a consensus around civic engagement alone doesn't necessarily lead us to a greater sense of justice, equity, fairness, etc. So I think that's all I will say by way of setting the stage. And I'm going to come back and talk a little bit about a project at the University of Illinois at Chicago where I teach called the Social Justice Initiative, which I'm very, very, very excited about. But I have the privilege in Chicago to work with some pretty amazing people. A lot of them women, not all of them women, but some pretty amazing women who always teach me, inspire me, provoke me, remind me of things that I said in the past that I've now forgotten. And we're going to talk, they're going to talk a little bit about the work that they do. And we're going to start with and people are going to introduce themselves a little bit. We're going to start with Martha Biondi, who is also a historian and teaches at Northwestern, has a fabulous, I have to say fabulous because you won't say it's fabulous new book called The Black Revolution on campus. And then we'll go to Lisa Yun Lee, who is currently the director of the Jane Addams Hull House Museum, which has done really amazing work. She's also an Adorno scholar and is transitioning to another role at UIC to direct the School of Art and Art History. And then Alice Kim will talk about some of her work, anti-torture work, as well as work with an organization called the Public Square that we all support and depend on. And Alice Kim is also a writer and does a lot of inspiring work on many fronts. Martha.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Barbara, for the introductions and the opening remarks, and thank you all for coming here. We're really happy to. How do you make the university relevant, they asked, to the pressing issues and struggles of the times? The war in Vietnam, the urban crisis, the Black Power movement, the youth revolt, a budding women's movement. They questioned who should be admitted to college, who should teach, how knowledge should be produced, and how the university should relate to the community. They fought to bring the community to campus and the campus to community, and created new collaborations and initiatives to make these exchanges possible. One theme I would like to convey this afternoon is the tremendous creativity that can come from such moments of experimentation and improvisation in which activists are consciously seeking to create new forms and foster a new consciousness. In the late 1960s, historian Vincent Harding observed that Black American students and intellectuals were following the call put out by political theorist and physician Frantz Fanon to build new institutions for the post-colonial world. I'll offer two examples of this quest to bridge town and gown. The first is an extraordinary series of filmed Black history lectures called Black History, Black Heritage, A History of Afro-Americans, which ran on television in New York City in 1969 and then was syndicated nationally. It grew out of a novel collaboration between a group of African-American scholars around the country, Columbia University, and WCBS-TV here in New York. It started at the urging of a group of scholar activists who wanted to bring the rich scholarship of Black studies to ordinary people. A core feature of the early Black studies movement was the idea that a new way of thinking about race and modernity, race and the history of the West, was central to reimagining the post-Jim Crow, post-colonial world. And I'll just say quickly what I mean when I say the early Black studies movement. I'm referring to an intellectual movement in the 1960s and 1970s that was part of a long tradition of Black arts and letters and scholarship. But in this particular moment was focused on bringing this intellectual presence and energy into predominantly white universities and colleges across the country. And it was propelled by Black student activism, and then the Black scholarly movement followed. But again, a core feature of this early Black studies movement was that this development should not be only confined to the campus, right? That education as liberation was relevant to all citizens. So it was not just students on college campuses who needed this new education and new consciousness, but citizens more broadly. Black Heritage ran 6 days a week from January to May, mimicking a college semester course. It featured the luminaries of the movement, many luminaries of the movement, including John Henrik Clark, Vincent Harding, Horace Mann Bond, St. Clair Drake, Toni Cade Mambara, and Barbara Ann Tier. Viewer response was extraordinary, even though there was a lot of protest that CBS put it on very early in the morning. They put it on at times that made it hard for kind of working people to actually watch it. Letters poured in praising the show and asking for more. Quote, every day since you began the lecture series, wrote a high school teacher in Trenton, New Jersey, we have been watching your program. We are using it as part of our classwork on Black history. The manager of a television station, are there chairs back here? There's one here. The manager of a television station in Hartford, Connecticut wanted it to run there. Let me support in the strongest possible terms the broadcasting of this series in our area, he wrote. The programs thus far have been extremely interesting, and the entire series promises to be lively as well as informative. I am sure they will be of considerable appeal. Of course, the curriculum on many campuses was still firmly Eurocentric at this time, and the series helped prod change on campuses as well. I'll give you one very local example. The president of the Black Student Organization at New York University urged the university's president to purchase the entire series for use in the classroom. Okay, now, moving to the West Coast. A second quick example. And these, if anybody wants to watch any segment, they're 108 30-minute film lectures, and they're really extraordinary. And they're housed at the Schomburg Center. So, and they're still on, when I first viewed them, they were kind of on old reel-to-reel formats. I don't know if they've been updated, but I urge you to view them at the Schomburg. They're really extraordinary. And they, in fact, inspired Howard Dodson, who was a graduate, who was to go to school, in graduate school, and study history. So he went to Berkeley, ended up becoming the director at the Schomburg for years, and that was a direct result of watching this series. A second quick example of an experimental, community-based Black education project was the Nairobi Schools, based in East Palo Alto, California. East Palo Alto was a predominantly Black town across the railroad tracks from affluent Palo Alto, home of Stanford University. Nairobi was an independent Black school system, including a 2-year junior college that began in 1969 and lasted a decade. Really an extraordinary length of time for an independent Black school system. It originated in part as a result of a philosophical shift in educational reform. Parents and community leaders were moving toward the idea of self-determination and community control of schools, finding integration impractical and bruising for their children. A visit by Stokely Carmichael to East Palo Alto, urging this new approach, had a big impact. And in fact, a ballot referendum to officially change the town's name to Nairobi after the Kenyan capital happened after his visit, but that ballot referendum failed. But still, the new schools proudly adopted this name. In addition to reflecting an ideological shift, Nairobi also arose from practical circumstances. Students and scholars were being fired or expelled from campuses due to their activism. The Nairobi system was unique in having a 2-year college. Robert Hoover founded Nairobi College after getting fired from San Mateo Junior College. Quote, "We had a sit-in inside the administration building and closed it down. A number of our kids got arrested and went to jail. They fired me," he said, and another professor in the program resigned. When we left, most of the students left, and those students formed the basis for the student body at Nairobi College. The college began with 120 students and 25 volunteer faculty members, teaching math, English, history, electronics, journalism, political science, and Swahili. A mixture of the routine and the radical, one participant observed. The curriculum was a collective effort, Hoover recalled, which emphasized student leadership, community engagement, and immersion in arts and culture. Nairobi survived as long as it did due to its creativity and initiative in forging partnerships with nearby universities and the California Department of Education, and as well due to the receptivity of these institutions. Robert Hoover had designed a highly successful minority student recruitment and retention program at San Mateo, which he had been called upon to replicate at colleges in California and across the country. As a result, he had a lot of contact with education officials in the state and was able to convince them to provide financial aid to Nairobi College, even though it was not accredited. This arrangement lasts the life of the college, enabling Nairobi students to receive federal grants and loans. In addition, Hoover and others at Nairobi forged productive relationships with nearby colleges. Stanford permitted Nairobi students to use their library and other facilities, and San Jose State and the University of California campuses at Irvine and Berkeley agreed to accept transfer students from Nairobi. Many students went on to Stanford University as well. We were able to get them to agree to take our students, even though we were not accredited, Hoover recalled. We told them, don't grant credit for their first semester. Just wait and see if they can do the work. And they agreed. In sum, and I can answer more questions later, these two examples are not the only two in which students and scholars in this era sought to reinterrogate the mission of higher education and inspire students and scholars to act on their political and ethical commitments. I named the book The Black Revolution on Campus because students use that phrase a lot, and this was one example of how they wanted to revolutionize higher education. So I will leave it at that, and again, we can talk more about any of this in the Q&A.
Thanks, Martha. All right, I'm going to have to do a little bit of shenanigans here because it doesn't advance with the thing, so I'll be doing, yeah. We'll be a little dancing. My name is Lisa Lee, and I'm the director of the Jane Addams Hull House Museum, and I sort of see myself as a cultural activist on campus and otherwise. And soon I will be the director of the School of Art and Art History, which also includes museum studies and a contemporary art gallery on campus. And today I'm really interested in exploring how museums and institutions of higher learning, which have traditionally been the spaces that the so-called 1% has so relied upon, the sort of bedrock places and institutions for reinscribing and the reproduction of power and privilege, how we might leverage that privilege and really be spaces and advocates and stand in solidarity with the so-called 99%. But first I'm going to tell you a little bit about the Hull House and the work that we've been doing and how I've sort of come to understand culture and its role in promoting social justice. So the museum is on the campus of UIC, and we're part of the College of Architecture and the Arts. And our mission is to preserve and interpret the legacy of Jane Addams and the remaining settlement house buildings. Jane Addams was a public philosopher and a sociologist who played a really key role in redefining democracy at the turn of the last century and really pushing for democracy to be more inclusive and participatory. And while working on the local level in Chicago, she was also one of the most prominent women in the early 20th century internationally. She influenced the development of national welfare policy, but also was known around the globe as an anti-imperialist. And she was part of that first generation of white women who were allowed to attend college. And she, with her colleagues, really stormed the public sphere with a wild impatience. This is just the inside of the museum. You sort of see we're a hybrid house museum and a museum and a house. And Addams was famous for saying, peace is not simply the absence of war. And for her, that meant that in order to create peace, you need to create the conditions for peace to flourish. And so she, with others, agitated for public housing and public health and fought for women's equality and insisted on immigrants' rights and labor rights and demanded justice for children and youth. This was on their way to The Hague. She is also sort of most famous for being the first American woman to win the Nobel Peace Prize in 1931. But she was also considered at one point to be America's most dangerous woman and public enemy #1. So we displayed the Nobel Peace Prize next to her FBI file. And we really celebrate the fact that she was both of these things. And she was considered so dangerous because she was a suffragist organizing women, and she was a pacifist working around the globe to demilitarize the world. But the crucial reason she was under FBI surveillance, as when you read these documents, is for the simple reason that she opened up the settlement doors for views and meetings and gatherings of people who did not always have the popular or mainstream views. She created opportunities for people to assemble and to discuss really controversial ideas. And she recognized that all the sort of protest and marching in the world might not be enough to bring about social change, and that we really needed space to convene, to argue, and grapple with the hard issues. And the Hull House settlement became that space for the many immigrants, social reformers, writers, artists, and scientists who found a home there. And people were really allowed to unleash their imaginations and envision a different world. We have a series of public programs, also our bus campaign about her being dangerous. And we have, it didn't come up. So we have a series of programs at the museum that really celebrate this history, and we want to preserve this history in a way to make it relevant to people's lives. And we really believe,
yes,
along with this graffiti that we found under a bridge, that no one is more relevant than Jane Addams. We've really become great fans of her. So I'm going to put that graffiti up. We just found it. Yeah, we just found it. Maybe Dan Tucker put it up. No. And I just want to give you a very concrete example of something that we've done. To really, what we see as a sort of active, creative reuse, adaptation, and repurposing of this history for the contemporary moment. One of the most pressing issues in Chicago now is one of food justice, really thinking about security and access issues. And one of the museum's buildings is actually a beautiful residence dining hall. It's a historic space where people like Du Bois, Ida B. Wells Barnett, Gertrude Stein, Susan B. Anthony had historically gathered to talk about issues. And as we were going through the archives, we sort of found beautiful photos, but also things like this, which really struck us. This was a hot coffee, soup, and roll program that the Hull House initiated so that local factory workers surrounding the Hull House would have hot food. And there's beautiful historic photos of the urban farming that went on in the city of Chicago. And Hull House had something called the People's Friendly Club, which operated over 400 different urban farms in vacant lots at the turn of the century. This is one of the big greenhouses that was in what is now Rogers Park area. And we realized that what we wanted to do was actually reopen our space and create a modern day soup kitchen to talk about food justice issues and to bring people together. So Rethinking Soup takes place every Tuesday between 12 to 1. We serve a free bowl of soup and a free organic conversation about a social issue. We link food to women's rights, labor, poverty, and other local and global issues. And we feed people's minds, their bellies, and their hunger for community. This was an event that we had with Allison Knowles called Make a Soup. We bring in activists like Winona LaDuke to talk about food security, but also link it with Native American rights, link it with the immigrants' rights movement today. And it's been, our most funded program, from Bank of America to the Institute for Museum and Library Sciences to the NEH. And then a few years ago, we decided to start an urban agricultural site on a nearby vacant property so that we could not only be consumers, but also co-producers of the food. And we have just, sort of turned over the farm to the Centers for Cultural Diversity on campus. So Florence Batista is one of the leaders of that. There was one of the centers at UIC, and they've been instrumental in helping us make this program even more expansive. We've just hired new farmers to work the site, and we really try to expand the notion of sustainability to include, not just resource management and also resource scarcity, but thinking about cultural and social sustainability and diversity. This is Carolyn from God's Gang, who is one of the farmers now at the site working with us. We also started a seed library that brings people together to cultivate and to spread this work throughout the city, and it's a really simple project. We store the seeds at the museum. You can get a free library card, and you check out the seeds, and as long as you return them, there's no fee, and if you fail to return the seed, or seed saved, then like a nominal charge is put to your account. Two really delightful young civic engagement students helped us research the history of the seeds. And so when you take out a seed, you learn the history, for example, of the Cherokee trailed bean, which carries with it this powerful story of resistance. And it was actually a seed that was saved on one of the marches of the Cherokees. And so in this way, we try to use our expertise in public history to tell the subterranean stories of where the seeds come from. There's a part of the project too now where the vegetables get picked up by Fresh Moves, a refurbished CTA bus that goes to food deserts in Chicago, and there's also, we've duplicated the seed library, and it's also on the bus, and that travels around. And just as we try to use our carrots to do work around environmental justice, the unofficial model of our museum is taken from John Berger's statement, "Never again will a single story be told as if it's the only one." And sometimes people describe this work as giving voice to the voiceless, but we know, of course, to quote the exquisite writer and activist Anjali Roy, that there's no such thing as the voiceless. They're only the deliberately silenced, or the preferably unheard. A lot of times people sort of assume that being a public institution means being more or less apolitical and presenting a so-called fair and balanced point of view. And as Barbara said, we disregard that notion. We really draw our inspiration from the history of Hull House settlement, which is a constant reminder that the public sphere is something that is and has always been historically constructed, creatively imagined, and a result of struggle. And being public is not simply being popular, the voice of the majority, but being a space where active dissent can take place. Recently in the Chicago Teachers Union, that meant for us, as a public institution, taking a stand against increasing privatization and corporatization of education, and really letting people know that there's this rich history of the support of unions and of labor and of teachers at the Hull House Museum. The closest Jane Addams ever came to articulating a mission for the Hull House settlement was to say that it was solidarity with the human race. And that's how we really approach our work with communities. Something that we've learned at the Hull House Museum is that Jane Addams and the other white progressives were constantly sort of thinking and reflecting about their own white privilege and acknowledging that their work with communities would be perhaps more transformative for themselves than the people that they're purporting to help. And that is sort of how we engage with communities too in the projects that we have within the museum spaces. And there's nowhere this is more evident than when we trace the sort of evolution of Hull House's involvement with the arts and culture and our current work in arts and culture. When Jane Addams first arrived at the Hull House, she had a really classical and conservative notion, which was culture referred to the appreciation of drama, literature, music, and art that was part of a set canon of excellence. And that meant there were reproductions of paintings by Italian Renaissance artists that hung in the Hull House. They did Shakespeare reading groups and George Eliot reading groups. And it was their desire to share the best of the best with all of humanity and make these things accessible. And on one level, that sort of sounds wonderful. But these initial efforts really gave way soon to an understanding of culture and taste that was much more inclusive, and one where culture is dynamically created through diverse social relationships, shared experiences, and cultural reciprocity, rather than simply being a result of good upbringing. And scholars like Raymond Williams and Dick Heptich have really described that these two conflicting paradigms of culture are at play all the time. On the one hand, there's this notion of culture, which is really rooted in aesthetic supremacy. It looks backward, and it considers everything that's excellent in the arts, the scholarly pursuits or manners, as these things which have been created by our forefathers and foremothers, and you see sort of the culture wars in the 80s and 90s played out with this understanding of culture, where you're struggling with who gets to be included in the canon. But Raymond Williams and others have shown that there's another meaning of culture which is much more forward-looking and moves away from immutable and fixed understandings of what is considered excellent to an emphasis on culture as relational, emerging from dynamic interactions, and something that's created between people in different social contexts in everyday life. And this is the definition that someone like T.S. Eliot puts forth in his book, Towards a Definition of Culture. He says, culture includes all the characteristic activities and interests of a people. Derby Day, Henley Regatta, cows, the 12th of August, a cup final, dog races, the pin table, a dartboard, Wensleydale cheese, boiled cabbage cut to sections, beetroot and vinegar, 19th century Gothic churches, and the music of Elgar. And at Hull House, you see the murals of Mexican artists and pottery created in the Hull House kilns, the Irish songs that fill the music rooms, the Greek tragedies that grace the Hull House stages, and the literature shared by immigrants from as far away as Korea and India. They all became a part of the life of refinement and cultivation of Hull House. And it made clear that the value of not only supporting excellence and creating access, but actually redefining what excellence was, and not just trying to make that which is beautiful accessible to all people, but really acknowledging the rights of all people to determine what is beautiful for themselves. And for us, sometimes Addams is known, and the Hull House settlement is known mostly for the public policy that they advanced in the United States, but they always argued for social, economic rights alongside the cultural rights of all people. So in addition to organizing unions and fighting for the 8-hour workday, they also put as much effort into the public art classes and the dance classes and the art studios. And that a peaceful and justful society is an achievement of not only these political and economic rights, but we really have to think about how culture plays into it too. And museums are sort of the most guilty and complicit of sort of dealing with these backward notions of culture and really hanging on to them. And when we try to be more expansive, it really is only about creating access to culture in this old way. And that really fosters this sort of philanthropic model of patronage, or noblesse oblige, or whatever you want to call it, where we become the gatekeepers of knowledge and culture. And museums have not actually been that. There's plenty of examples where people have upthrown that notion too. So, for example, just the Louvre, which is the world's largest and most visited art museum in the world, was created during the French Revolution and was seized by the people from Louis XIV, and the National Assembly decreed that it should be used as a museum to display the people's masterpieces. And one of the questions that we ask at the museum is always, how do we actually reproduce our own privilege, and how can we use this privilege to actually advance something differently? And so I'm just going to tell a couple of projects really quickly. So, for example, we have been working with a group of sex-positive activists in Chicago who are really concerned with the negativity surrounding sexuality and the way it's talked about, and they host a film series at the museum, which has also allowed us to sort of take our artifacts and rethink them and make them relevant in a new way. Hull House had helped to found Chicago's first birth control clinic and talk about, the reformers there talked about women's sexuality and pleasure, and we had never really found a space to talk about these artifacts or this history, but it's with our partnerships that we have started to do that. We also have been working with prison reform and activists, one group called TAMS Year 10, which is working to close down a maximum security prison in Illinois, and we created sort of action stations within the museum where you can learn about the history of juvenile justice, but then also send a postcard in solidarity with people who were in TAMS, and just really beautiful postcards were created. This is the action station, and when Luis Rodriguez came to Chicago, he visited us and wrote like 25 postcards to people. And we have a pop-up print shop now in the museum where you can actually also make your own postcard and send a piece about the need for art education in schools to Arnie Duncan or to any of the school principals or other people in public policy in Chicago. Recently, we also partnered with the Insane and Conservative Vice Lords, a gang in Chicago, to tell the story about Black empowerment and community development that is often not told. They've worked along with the Panthers and Blackstone Rangers to clean up neighborhoods, and this exhibit is off-site in galleries as well as in local restaurants and facilities in Englewood and Lawndale, and we've put sort of the museum posters and artifacts in these local storefronts. And then our most recent project is one that is actually done also with research from Asha, who's Barbara's daughter, and also in consultation with people like Pamela, who is an activist working on domestic workers' rights. And sometimes when you hear about hear the word home economics, you sort of think of canning peaches or sewing dresses or baking snickerdoodles. But this is not the full history of this movement's past, and it doesn't really engage with the radical potential of its future. Hull House reformers, many of them were home economists that really brought about what has been called the grand domestic revolution on all levels of society, from the household to the city to the nation. And they attempted to create a world that included healthy food, fair labor practices for homemakers and domestic workers, thoughtful consumption, and community childcare solutions. And so along with key community partners now, we imagine a new wave of home economics that sort of grapples with the successes and failures of this earlier generation and includes questions of labor, gender, immigration, race, and global justice. And just this, the last thing I'll say is we've been working, for example, with the Latino Union in Chicago, which is partnered with the National Domestic Workers Union to try and pass the similar Bill of Rights that was passed here in New York in Illinois. And the project that they wanted to do with us was to donate artifacts to the museum that actually speak to that makes the work, that makes visible the work that makes all other work possible. And so, for example, people have donated a hand brace that that was gifted to her by an employer. This is a notebook that is by a woman named Mirna, who she entitled it a freedom notebook. And it's all of her musings and thoughts about invisible labor as she was taking care of this elderly gentleman. And a lot of this work, like I was saying, we feel like, oh, we're lending our access and privilege to an organization. But in our conversations with these groups, they've asked critical questions of us, like, who actually cleaned the Hall House and who took care of the reformers. And for us, we never told the story of Mary Kaiser, who was the housekeeper at Hall House, and we were so complicit in sort of the historical amnesia about the work that actually made all of this justice work possible. And so it's been completely transformative for how we talk about our history, and it's been just a really great experience. We're looking forward to it. The exhibit opens on December 10th, and we'll also have a CTA campaign with the Latino Union about invisible labor in Chicago.
Great.
Hi, I'm Alice Kim. I direct a program called Public Square, which is a program of the Illinois Humanities Council that creates spaces for public conversations. Lisa was actually the co-founder of the Public Square. Barbara at one point took a sabbatical to run the Public Square for a year, and Martha is on the advisory board of the Public Square.
A little incestuous.
Before I came on board to the Public Square, I was an anti-death penalty organizer, national organizer for a grassroots group called the Campaign to End the Death Penalty, and I'm going to talk about some of that work too. And before that, I worked for a national HIV research study that looked at the progression of HIV disease in women. Okay, I wanted to start by just sharing some experiences from my work as an anti-death penalty organizer. Basically, I'm going to riff on some of the ideas and themes that Barbara outlined in her introductory remarks. She spoke about the bastions of creativity outside of the academy, and I learned from my work that death row is actually one of those bastions of creativity. And so when you think about death row, you don't necessarily, you think about the worst of the worst, right? You think about people who are thought of as criminals, murderers, so on and so forth. And what I learned was that there was just so much ingenuity that could be found on death row and from these men. So it was actually a group of African-American men who dubbed themselves the Death Row 10. They came up with this name. They had learned, we found each other on death row and learned that each of them had been tortured by this same group of white Chicago police officers under the command of John Burge. So they called themselves the Death Row 10. I think just a brilliant name in and of itself. And they reached out to everybody they possibly could think of on the outside, activists on the outside, and asked them to be their voices and their legs on the outside. And I had the honor and the privilege of working with some of these men and their family members for over a decade. But one of the things that they actually came up with is this idea to speak to people, like in an audience, in a classroom, directly. So initially when we started doing some of this work, we had their family members speak about their cases. As organizers, we spoke about their cases, and then one of them said, well, wait a minute, I want to talk to the people in the room. And they dubbed this thing called they came up with this idea called Live from Death Row. And so what we actually did was, they would call into one of our phones and we would amplify this phone call, and they got to speak to audiences direct from their cells. And this was an incredibly powerful experience, and it was done over and over in cities across the country. People got to hear from Ronnie Kitchen, Stanley Howard, Aaron Patterson, Leroy Orange, and hear what it was like from their own mouths. So that's just one example of the kind of creativity that came from death row. They also called demonstrations on their own. So they say, we want you to demonstrate out in front of the police headquarters, and then, right, and you call up all our family members, so on and so forth, get my mom out there. And they actually even made the flyers themselves. So they basically, from newspaper clippings and things like that, they pasted together a flyer, and then they sent it to us and said, okay, here you go. We need this kind of demonstration happening. So I feel like those were, just some of the examples of what these men on death row were sort of scheming and coming up with on their own. They often referred to their cells as their war rooms. The other thing, I feel like it was from death row prisoners that I also learned sort of the power of art, because some of them were able to, at a time when painting was allowed, they painted the most beautiful paintings, and suddenly I just started receiving some paintings. They could only have so much in their cells, so I started getting some of these paintings from them, and it was, to me, just a real expression of humanity, right? So that in cells that are no bigger than a bathroom, that they were able to, mostly they took drawings that they saw from a book and then they recreated them on their own. So, what's it called, the Lady Liberty, right, with the blindfold.
Justice.
Paintings like that. I started receiving paintings like that, and at one point then a group of us said, why don't we actually display some of these paintings and, have an art show that shows their work. Let me see, I have a little bit of a hodgepodge of notes from different places. Oh yeah, I mean, to me it's, there's that beautiful Gwendolyn Brooks poem, Boy Breaking Glass, whose broken window is a cry of art, success that links aware as elegance as a treasonable faith is raw, is sonic, is old-eyed premier, our beautiful flaw and terrible ornament, our barbarous and metal little man. I shall create, if not a note, a whole, if not an overture, a desecration. So for me, these lines speak to the raw, creative human spirit that can both desecrate and delight, and I think we see this in the lives of death row prisoners. So in Illinois, I think that these efforts, right, the prisoners making the flyers themselves, calling in for Live from Death Row, their paintings, which we shared with the public, all of these things serve to put a human face on the death penalty, which I think was actually critical to abolishing the death penalty ultimately in our state, and also to exonerating over 20 men now in Illinois. So I guess I want to say that about that. And I guess just moving on to Barbara's point about practicing freedom. I guess I just want to say that I also think that in practicing freedom, we need to practice democracy. So the work that I currently do now with the public square is about creating spaces for dialogue. And essentially, I think practicing democracy through dialogue. So I guess I just want to share a few examples of how we do that. So recently, there's Daniel Tucker moderated and facilitated a conversation at Garfield Park Conservatory, and it was about the role of the artist in creating a sustainable future. So at the Garfield Park Conservatory, there was an exhibit called the Chicago's 12, and that was based on 12 artists who are mobilizing the earth. So they all use sustainable practices to create works of art that were really integrated and incorporated into the Garfield Park Conservatory itself. What we found through this series called The Art of Dissent, when we have people come collectively to view exhibits like the Chicago's 12, is that often people don't know necessarily what to think of the art and remain consumers of the art. By creating these discussions around these exhibits, I feel like we're able to move people from being consumers to actually engaging with the art and interacting with the art. So Daniel actually facilitated this conversation with a number of the artists, and we asked questions and dealt with the contradictions of our own complicity in not having a sustainable future for ourselves, but also thinking about what it is that we can actually do beyond the practice of art making in our everyday lives to create a more sustainable future. Also, we have another series called Cafe Society, and so I can actually point to Asha, who facilitated a conversation this summer. She is a poet and also involved in a group called Young Chicago Authors. So she organized a Cafe Society discussion at Young Chicago Authors around the NATO protests and the role of the police in the protests. And so, again, it's about practicing democracy, bringing it to our everyday spaces, and having these discussions. The role of the police was an incredibly controversial issue in Chicago when NATO came to town. So in this Cafe Society series, we featured a poem that Asha wrote about the police, alongside an editorial in the Chicago Tribune written by somebody who was actually defending the police. And then Asha facilitated a conversation with other young poets and other people in the community about this topic. So I think, again, practicing democracy through dialogue by taking up sometimes really hard and controversial issues, but bringing these conversations into our own spaces. So. Okay, from there, yes, I want to move to another point that Barbara made, which was about unleashing our radical imaginations. And I think, for me, a motivation behind unleashing our radical imaginations is to address fiercely urgent issues, right? And one of the ways that we've been doing that in Chicago is through this project called the Chicago Torture Justice Memorials. So I just wanted to say a little bit about that and then hand it back over to Barbara. So the Chicago Torture Justice Memorials Project is comprised of artists, activists, lawyers, and scholars. And we basically came together to address the issue of police torture in Chicago. As I mentioned earlier, over 100 African-American men were systematically tortured by Chicago police. So there's this history of torture, 2 decades of torture through the 70s and 80s, and then really 2 decades of struggle, the 90s into the 2000s, and then where we're at currently in this fight. And I think that for us, the challenge is to remember, to recall this ugly history, to honor the torture survivors, to honor the struggle as a means to urge further action around this issue. And what we did was, over a process of actually a couple of years, several years, we put a call out to artists and all those seeking justice to submit speculative proposals memorializing the police torture cases. And we held charrettes, we held educationals, we held different kinds of teach-ins, offering people the opportunity to create their own speculative proposals. And over the course of 2 years, we received over 70 submissions that came from all over the world. And just this past Friday, we were able to display these submissions in an exhibit called Opening Up the Black Box, The Charges Torture, at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. And I wasn't able to be there opening night, but Lisa was there. And it really was an incredible, I think, expression of memory, an incredible expression of honoring struggle, and an incredible sort of call to action to say, never again. And for me, it was an incredibly humbling process to see the kind of care that went into the installation and the actualization of each proposal, as we thought about how do we actually take something that was written, on a piece of paper and, turn it into something that can visually represent what what this person seeks to illustrate with this proposal. So you can actually look at it on our website and so on and so forth. But it's, I think, just an example of, forging linkages between artists, scholars, activists, torture survivors themselves, in a kind of community process that really speaks to the kind of activism that can make change, but also looking at the making of art as part and parcel of that process. So Lisa quoted Arundhati Roy, and I also just wanted to quote her because I think that this quote just really speaks to the way that we can approach our work of civic engagement and social justice, and speaks to the work of the Chicago Torture Justice Memorials Project. To never forget your own significance, to never get used to the unspeakable violence and the disparity of life around you, to seek joy in the saddest places, to pursue beauty to its lair, to never simplify what is complicated or complicate what is simple, to respect strength, never power, above all to watch, to try and understand, to never look away, and never, never to forget.
Great. So we are busy bees in Chicago doing lots of different kinds of organizing, research, writing, exhibition, provocation, hell-raising. So I want to say a little bit about, very little bit about the social justice initiative at University of Illinois at Chicago. And we go till 3:30, right? Mm-hmm. So we're 2:55 now, and we want to hear what you all think and say, and then I have some big questions that I'm hoping all the smart people in the room can help me answer. So I will go away fulfilled. UIC is an urban public university in the middle of Chicago. And in some ways has had an identity crisis about what and who it's going to be, right, in the world. But at UIC, there's a lot of scholarship, engagement, creative projects around human rights, democracy, social justice across the campus, from a ceasefire program, which is a violence intervention program in School of Public Health, to Beth Ritchie does work at the Institute for Research on Race and Public Policy around mass incarceration, through our cultural centers that do amazing work, the Hull House Museum, etc. The Social Justice Initiative at the university is an attempt to foreground, coordinate, connect the dots between work going on campus, but also to look outward and to foster new community connections and collaborations. But it's not just about that. It's really using justice as the bridge and the arc for those connections. And I think that's a significant point. So it's not about connections for the sake of connections. There's a part of the mission of the university that says we want to create new, I'm paraphrasing it because I didn't write it down, but create new knowledge that changes our view of the world and therefore helps us better understand how to change the world. And I've been echoing that and reminding everyone at the university of that as much as possible. So the Social Justice Institute, in a sense, is, I come out of various political traditions, but one is a feminist tradition, which, and particularly a women of color feminist tradition, which has very much emphasized intersectionality. And intersectionality is a particular frame that insists that we come out of our disciplinary silos, insists that we come out of our identity silos, insists that we sort of reach out and connect, but not in an old-fashioned coalition way of you got your issue, I got my issue, we'll stick together until, the glue starts to, the adhesive starts to get thin. But rather a quilting tradition, and there's people in the room who've worked with me in the project called Ella's Daughters, in a quilting tradition where you take very, very different patches and you gently weave them together so that they become a part of something new and connected. Each patch can have its own integrity and its own colors and its own character, right? But that it becomes a part of something new, something useful and beautiful, and it comes out of collective work. So it's that idea of political quilting, and it's that idea of intersectionality that has undergirded the Social Justice Initiative, to really try to particularly get academics to betray our professional training, in a sense, which is to collaborate in the privatization of knowledge production, but to turn that around and to engage communities and activists and others in the process of collective knowledge production. We have done some specific things. We had a summer institute that involved students, and out of that grew something called Social Justice Laboratory. We've also made space, and I've learned a lot from my creative colleagues and friends about the importance, and my daughter, about the importance of art and poetry and all this. So we've occupied, if you will, some unused retail space that the university owns for what we're calling pop-up just art centers, just as in justice. And Sharon Haar has been involved in that, Lori Batista, who's here, and others, in creating that as space where we will have exhibitions, some not as polished as the Hull House Museum, but our own, attempts at exhibitions. But mainly in the space will also be a place to come together to workshop ideas and to try to create an architecture or an infrastructure for collective thinking about social justice problems. And again, in some ways, for people who've been trained to have a very private view and a very careerist view of knowledge development and knowledge production, that's a little viscerally antithetical to our training. And so we're trying to work on how to do that and how to make it easier and rewarding and meaningful to do that work. We've had a couple of fellows who have come, Rose Brewer, who is doing work around community gardens and doing research around community gardens, Ivan Arenas, who does work on the art of protest in Oaxaca, Mexico, is going to also help with one of the exhibitions. We had an interesting event recently with Joanie Williams, who is our first distinguished Jane Addams Social Justice Fellow. I always have to get the whole title right. And she's also a Nobel Peace Laureate. She won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1997 for her work to end landmines, and she's going to come to campus several times during the year to help be a catalyst for bringing folks together. We had a wonderful community meeting with her, and we also had Reverend Jesse Jackson Sr. Come and facilitate a discussion in the Hull House Museum around peace building, and with the main ingredient being justice. And so to kind of flip the script on what it means to build peace in Jane Addams' tradition, which is not just the absence of war, but the presence of justice, and to talk about what that means. In Chicago right now, of course, there's much publicity about youth violence in communities, but it often gets discussed in a very perverted and skewed way about human pathology rather than about the continuum of violence in the society and the world, and framing the need for justice as an antidote to that. We're also doing working groups and trying to tackle various problems. And one idea, and I'm just playing with this name of it, but talking about the freedom and justice classroom of connecting scholars doing work around justice issues around the country, but the idea of a praxis faculty, of what does it mean to think about theory and practice and that line between theory and practice, and that's one of the questions I'm going to throw out in just a minute. So I think those are the key ingredients to the Social Justice Initiative. It's really just launching, and probably the greatest strength is the exciting array of people, both at UIC and beyond, who are working with us, talking with us, thinking with us, pushing back about what we're trying to do there. And hopefully that will be one more of a number of meaningful sites for social justice work. Lisa Brock is here, who is the director of the the Arcus Center for Social Justice Leadership at Kalamazoo College, which is another site for this kind of work. And Lisa's actually pulling together a summit of people doing social justice, explicitly social justice projects on university campuses around the country. Now what I'll do to segue into discussion, and folks up here, we've had a chance to talk a lot, and you've been all about not just talking at you, but then we've been doing a lot of talking. But to throw some questions out for your consideration, and to come back to Alice, Lisa, and Martha. And I'm going to ask a question very selfishly, because it's my question that keeps me up at night. One of my colleagues said to me recently, he said, I like what you're doing, it's really interesting, but you all just talk a lot. And we used to get this when we were going to donors asking for money for Public Square. It's like, isn't it just talk? I mean, so my question is, in navigating a praxis, right, and praxis is that term, the articulation of theory and practice, where does talk stop and action begin? And I don't mean that in the obvious, simple way, right? Is this action? When is speech action? When is talking and thinking and moving our heads and hearts and ideas in a certain direction a form of intervention and action? Right? Oh, you have the answer? Dude, this has been keeping me up at night. You can answer. I definitely need to know who you are. But let me just throw the other questions out. And then you can the other question is around funding. Because the reality is that many of the projects that we're involved in require funding, require resources. How do we mobilize those resources without compromise? Some people have done work around something they call the nonprofit industrial complex. It's not exactly my language, but you know, but what kind of compromises do we make around funding, and are there creative ways to get around that? And Lisa has some ideas on the subject. And then where we started is this question of advocacy and activism within the academy. How legitimate is that? How does that support, reinforce, or compromise our role as teachers, those of us who play that role? So those are the big questions, I think, that we think a lot about. We have some baby answers, but maybe we might get some grown-up answers out of the room. Yeah.
Well, I'm not going to suggest I know the answer or that I'm a grown-up, but so a thread that I want to start by saying I have the privilege of working at Visual AIDS, and we're a 25-year-old organization that uses art to remind the world that AIDS is not over. So in a sense, this is the beginning of my supposed answer, that when speech begins to change behaviors, sense of self, and the way we understand the world, that's how we know that action is taking place. So for example, at Visual AIDS, using everything from the Red Ribbon to the Day Without Art to the way we engage with artists living with HIV or not living with HIV to create new art and spark conversation, we see people using condoms, right? But we also see that people are reducing stigma in their own language or a sense of self. So that's the answer to that. And then if I can, am I allowed to ask a question as well? Can I throw a question out there?
For a minute.
I guess I'm wondering, so related to my work and related to everything that you guys are talking about in terms of civic engagement and intersectionality, how do you think about audience? How do you think about who do you want, who do you need, and who do you have?
Okay. You all want to tackle that? Well, Lisa thinks more about audience than I do, I think. But I even have trouble with the term audience, right? Because it assumes almost a unidirectional, that I'm here and you're there, your audience, I'm spectacle or whatever, which happens on occasion. But I think of who is community, and how do you think of community? And for me, that is really making a campus much more porous, really bringing people into that conversation and process of grappling with ideas and grappling with strategies for social justice and social change. So I prefer to think of it as community than audience. But I think when you have an exhibition, people come and they are looking at it, they're engaging too. So I don't know if you want to say something about that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I guess I'll say that from our our past decade of working together, one thing is we always talk about the many different publics that exist, and we don't ever use sort of the singular homogeneous sort of notion of sort of people out there. And I'm a real devotee of the theories of Mark Warner and Lauren Berlant and sort of in queer theory, where there is this notion that Mark Warner puts forth that the public is one which is always coming into being through a form of address. And there's actually a really wonderful exhibit now at Cooper Union, which is called Forms of Address, which is about political protest. And there's a sense that, we are actually engaged actively in the process of becoming ourselves and also bringing into the public a public into existence that you would imagine sort of in a utopian way. I mean, it's like a very circular thing in some ways, but Warner opens up one of his essays about this, talking about 1984 and Winston, who's the main character, or is it Brave New World, right? No, it's in 1984, where, you know, he has writer's block, and it's because he's writing in his own diary, you know, and in his diary, he's realizing that the person who's going to read it is his future self, and it's not the self that he is now. And, you know, there's a lot of conversation about, you know, that there's somehow, like, Fox Network tries to pretend that what they say is for an audience that already exists, and that they sort of relieve their responsibility for what they do. And I think for how we think about it often is, you know, the future and the work for social justice is thinking about this not yet, you know, utopian space and the not yet utopian public that we would like, you know, to bring into being. But that doesn't disregard the very actual matter that there are real multiple publics out there too. And I just want to quickly then say the thing about theory and practice, which is I am a committed critical theorist. I'm a Frankfurt School sort of you know, person by training. And so whereas I believe that there needs to be a sort of blurring of theory and practice and sort of bringing about of praxis. And Frankfurt School scholars were really famous for always saying, you know, thinking is the first act of resistance in a sort of a way of blurring these boundaries, that these are really different kinds of activities in the practice of freedom. And that it's not that you would privilege one over the other, but in the sort of pragmatist tradition where the theory needs to constantly be checked by what the practice is, and then the practice should also be questioned and interrogated by theory. And that at the Hull House, for example, Jane Addams, who was an essay writer, she never actually marched in the streets, never was arrested. There was space for... Yeah.
Diminished her status.
No, but that's the thing. Like, people like you want to diminish that. The thing is, though, is that her partner, Ellen Gates Starr, was always getting arrested, and she was, you know, wrote many letters to Jane Addams saying, just when we should be protesting, you go into your room and write an essay. But the reason why Hull House was so successful was because they valued and embraced both those different practices of freedom.
And I think if you're in a collective, you can do that, perhaps. We would probably, and we do disagree a little bit on, I see much more of an organic, intimate, symbiotic connection between theory and practice. I think you have to go out into other streets, at least on occasion, in order to animate your theory and your theoretical understanding, and also to be able to speak in a language that people beyond theoreticians can understand, and that's really important in terms of theoretical impact. Martha wanted to get in.
Well, just your question about audience, thank you, reminded me of sort of critical debate that arose in the early Black Studies movement. And it was really linked to people's sense of what was ultimately the mission of Black Studies and who needed to sort of hear it. And a lot of early pioneers really saw the audience as Black students. And the goal of Black Studies was to give Black students, you know, this important history and information that would reorient consciousness and lead to a political, instead of then graduating from an elite fancy university and getting a job at Wall Street, but sort of push you back to the community to be of service. And so it had a, you know, the goal was to have a politicizing effect. At least this was the perspective of some of the founders. For others, it became, no, the audience should be multiracial, the audience should be diverse, and then the goal of that, right, is to sort of reconstitute citizenship and to create a new notion of what the nation is more broadly. And so those were different conceptions, and they were often, you know, they were conceptions different people in the same department could have. They changed over time, but they were very explicit and they were highly debated. So that's just kind of, you know, one specific answer there. And you can actually see it in some of the letters that people who watch Black Heritage. I mean, you see both of these in play. And then I think just quickly to Barbara's question about the role of sort of scholarship and activism, again, this was something very much at the center of the Black Studies movement, and it was something that was very controversial at the time. I mean, even though Black Studies programs and departments were sort of victories of the late 1960s, many universities really still doubted the legitimacy of these new units. And in two ways there was a struggle. One, I mean, Black Studies was not a single thing, it was a complicated thing. It was both a political insurgency and a political critique, but it was a long tradition of intellectualism. I mean, this was a legitimate scholarly field. And the universities were not recognizing that, but they were also sort of disavowing the political message. So there's a fight to say we're both academically legitimate, but then a fight to carve out this new space for a scholar activist. And I think there were two legacies of that struggle to carve out that space for a scholar activist. On the one hand, I think there was a kind of liberal version incorporated. Students were calling for relevancy, and I think you see that all over the campuses today, in internships and field studies. This idea that experiential learning is part of education, I think, has been kind of absorbed in the university. But this notion of a scholar activist, I think that these, and it's just not Black studies, but ethnic studies, Latino studies, gender and women's studies, I think have had some degree of success in carving out space for a scholar activist. But at the same time, this notion, this paradigm of the scholar, the ideal scholar, as this detached person who's objective and kind of separate, right, from these political currents, I think still has a lot of purchase and has a lot of appeal. So I still think we are coming up against that all the time, although students love engaged scholarship. So that's my quick answer to that.
Okay, should I take a, yeah. So, and let's take a few questions and then, well, yes, sir, in the back.
Perhaps I should introduce myself first. I'm Bob Lee. I'm with the Asian American Arts Center in New York City. We've been there since '74. We started exhibiting Asian American artists in '83. So online you can see many of the artists that we've exhibited over the years looking at contemporary Asian American art. From what you're saying, it seems to me that, and it's probably very valid, is to develop a culture of protest. I remember the first black takeover of the law school at Rutgers Newark in Newark, New Jersey, and I remember being rejected by Leroy Jones to join his little group in Newark.
I was rejected by him too.
Oh, yeah.
If you haven't been rejected by him.
Anyway, it's perhaps necessary to have a culture of resistance, a culture of protest, in order to dismantle what we have. But on the other hand, to create a real open dialogue and not put our adversary in a defensive position. To be able to open the door to have a true dialogue with them, we have to see them on an equal footing. And otherwise they're just promoting their guilt. And some will enjoy the guilt and others will back off from it. Recently, another Asian American organization in New York City evolved a program which I thought very interesting, called Locating the Sacred. And they put it on in a lot of mainstream locations in the city over a period of 10 days. It was interesting in that it seemed to, at least for the ones that I got to go to, that it brought in a good deal of mainstream people, and less the number of Asian American audience that I would have expected. But it still has potential in that perhaps the Asian American art activities will attract more New Yorkers than it has in the past. And in that sense, there has been a sympathy. In other words, what is sacred to you? Maybe just walking down a path among a lot of trees or near a stream is something you do daily, and that's what you see as sacred. And so there's some place where we can join in together. We can share a common space. I mentioned this yesterday at the plenary, and that is that we're involved, or so I guess we're all, but mainly I'm not an academic, so you're involved in planning and thinking in this way. Whereas the event that they were having, these art events dealing with the sacred, were not involved with that kind of thinking. It was more a kind of sharing where you find a common space, and then based upon what evolves, what feelings evolve from that, develops what others have called a structure of feeling. And so I think that there's another step that needs to be taken. And perhaps if the Asian community can locate who they are within this American context, that they can be instrumental in creating not just a black and white, but a third location of where activism can come from.
Okay, I'm going to, because you raise a lot of rich questions, and I would love to talk to you more about a lot of them. I have many, many thoughts. But I'm going to you all have sat here patiently, quietly. So I'm going to take a couple more questions if there are, and then invite, kind of go around, one last go round of the panel to kind of respond to ones they feel they have something to respond to. Yes?
Hi, I'm from the museum field,
Okay.
and so I'm especially interested in what the whole house does, but also about your comment about kind of saying we're being provocative, but then stepping back and going the actual objective as well. So even like, museums have this habit of being small c conservative, but even at their best, there is this, oh yeah, we can provoke, oh yes, we can make relevant, we can do all these things, but there is this kind of stopping point at, well, but we can't upset people because they won't come, or we can't upset people because they won't give us money. And so how, and I don't know if this is even answered, but how do we push back past that and say, yes, there are ways to do this?
Okay. Yes.
I'll be brief. It's not really a question. I've been sitting here wondering why I thought this was such a good thing. I mean, what is it about it and that is exemplary in terms, maybe not of an answer to your question, but just sort of understanding what's going on here. And what I've seen that I think is so invigorating, and I never go to Chicago. I'm ready to move there. Yeah, because
Panel was a success.
yeah, it is a success because what I see you doing is using your scholarship in a non-self-shaming way to open up spaces of reflection and action that are very appealing. They're very situated. They're very specific. I didn't know anything about Hull House, but you brought your historical research and knowledge and critical understanding to create urgencies that were based upon some connection to the past, but had a present iteration. So I just want to say that. I think it is extremely invigorating, and to also inflect what you're doing with the question of, well, how am I transforming myself? Which is not a question, again, of self-shaming, but on the contrary, it's saying how I develop has some sort of paradigmatic relevance. I just think it's very powerful, and that's all.
Thank you. That's a kind comment.
Yeah, I just want to echo that. It was great. And then I just wanted to raise an issue with the application of scholar activists, because I don't know how to use that well, and I think it reveals the problems. And to just invoke Erin Dr. Roy, because she's been brought up by a couple of you, I remember hearing an interview with her when somebody referred to her as a writer activist, and her discomfort with that, and she was kind of funny. I thought she said it's like, a sofa bed. But it
Not the sofa bed.
But it does, the fact that the scholar activist is singled out differently than just the activist or just the scholar. Something about it needs more work, and it's uncomfortable, and I'd just like to get maybe something on that at some point. But
Okay.
great work.
Okay. Brief one from Daniel Tucker, and then we'll hear from folks.
Do you have the hand up?
Yeah.
Oh, it is, on your finger.
I guess just the quick question is, I think this kind of connects to all the presentations in some way, is that like a lot of the practices that you're talking about, whether like historical or contemporary, are sort of these like discipline breaking kind of efforts, and like some of them, like the historical ones of like African American studies, were like almost sort of produced new disciplines, and some of the more contemporary practices are sort of like, while breaking them down, like it just kind of brings up a question for me, like as we or you mobilize sort of institutional resources at higher levels to kind of like shift to almost sort of like produce more of the kind of culture that you're talking about, there's sometimes, there almost runs like a risk, I wonder if you think this, to kind of like produce new disciplines as the sort of solution, the institutional kind of form for like the practices that you're sort of advocating. And so I'm just sort of wondering what you all think about that, and also drawing from the historical lessons of like, well, what happened to, and I'm not saying like that at all, like the historical project that you're describing is over, but like what happened to some of those initiatives that, where they maybe became more codified in a disciplinary kind of way that made them maybe less dynamic or revolutionary.
Anybody can start, but you all only have a minute and a half. We have to go through.
Can I just jump in on that one? I promise with
for a
one.
minute and a half.
Yeah, okay. So, I mean, I might have a different approach to interdisciplinariness because of the Frankfurt background, but, they were considered an interdisciplinary school, but they believed that the disciplines were radically important and had different logics. It's just that when you brought them into close conversation, you could see the failures and the contradictions within each of the disciplines, right? So, even though sometimes people say, oh, you're really challenging what it means to be a museum, I think actually we're becoming exactly what a museum does. So I have a long, sort of debate with Nina Simon, who's a museum thinker, who really says, museums don't need objects anymore, and that museums can be community centers. And then I think, yeah, but then you would be a community center, right? So, but what does it mean to be a museum and to take objects, but not to do it in sort of that false, neutral, objective way, but to acknowledge that the history of objects that has been sort of collected has been mostly white, male, patricians, and to sort of say, well, what would it mean to actually collect the people's history and to display them as objects? That's what museums do. That's not necessarily what another institution or another discipline might do, but that's what we do, and that's how we should do it best. So that's sort of, and I feel the same about history as a public historian. That's what I do as a historian, but it may not be what I do as a philosopher. But when I sort of bring them into close contact is when I see the failure of any particular discipline. So that's sort of my stance on that.
Alice or Mark, do you want to jump? Don't forget the earlier question.
Yeah, okay, well, I'll just try and respond very quickly to 2 points. So I agree. I mean, the phrase scholar activist, it reminds me a little bit of like Lady Doctor, It's very, it's a concession, and it's sort of, but I mean, I do think that, it's our lack of vocabulary, and it's like responding to people's, these entrenched notions of what constitutes a scholar and who's an activist, and trying to sort of legitimize a new form, and the fact that we don't have a better way of explaining it, perhaps signifies the continuing challenge we face. And to the question of sort of the discipline and like wanting to be part of the canon, yet critique the canon, and how does that change over time? I mean, I could just, a quick example for African American studies, I mean, I think there's a lot of discussion within the discipline about that, and a real embracing of the sense of being conscious of that and critical of it and sort of skeptical, and so, and embracing kind of redefinition. At least we try and do this, and some departments do, and like resisting being frozen in time. So what's our relationship to ethnic studies? What's our relationship to sort of race and diaspora more broadly? We're changing our name probably next year of our department. So like having this ongoing discussion of your relationship to sort of groups inside and outside the academy, like embracing that notion of relevance all the time. There's a living wage campaign on campus. What's our relationship to that? So continuing to ask those questions and have those conversations is one way. But I'll stop there.
Because I don't bristle as much at the term scholar activist, and maybe it's because as an activist, when scholars choose to identify themselves as a scholar activist, I feel a sense of, okay,
that's
this
my
is your side. Yeah, and so that there's actually, a place where we can begin to work together and, an identification with activism that I feel like I value a lot. So to me, I see sort of the problems that are raised with it, and maybe there does need to be a new language, but I do feel like it's an identification that I know that I value. And then it's about, well, what do you actually mean by that? Because I've also found a lot of people then, now that it's become somewhat fashionable too, I guess, identify themselves as a scholar activist, but, what are you doing to really, work with communities, work with activist organizations, and use sort of a position at a university to forward various causes. So there's that. And then I guess just to say, just one tiny word about the question of audience. Because for me, it's about who's in the room. So I actually have a lot of curiosity even about whatever room I'm in. I have a lot of curiosity about who's there, and especially when you're in a room where you don't necessarily know the people, right? So I'm very curious about who's in this room, and also who's not in this room, right? So I feel like that's a question we have to constantly ask ourselves, whatever communities we're in, whatever it is that we're engaging in, whether it's an exhibit that you're co-curating, a program that you're putting on, who's in the room, who's not in the room. But that also, I feel like what people have talked about on this panel, it's just about that. In terms of who's in the room and who's not, it's often those who are not in the room who have insisted that they be in the room. So whether it's death row prisoners insisting that they have a voice in the struggle, whether it's their family members who previously weren't at the table when it came to sort of the abolitionist movement and had many others speaking for them, or if it was Black students on campus insisting that they have a voice in higher education. I just feel like that oftentimes it doesn't come from above or elsewhere in terms of who's in the room. It comes from the people who are outside the room saying, we actually belong here.
Great. Lisa wanted to say one quick sentence.
Oh, I just wanted to respond to Bob's point, right? About, I agree that we cannot always be in this sort of defensive and critical mode of being a protest culture, but I disagree with the notion that we should just try to find a common ground and assume that we actually share something with everyone. And rather, I would sort of say, well, why not us also switch to sort of advance not just what we're against, but what we're for. And to be inclusive and generous in inviting people to tell us what they are for too. And that would be one method of not compromising a sort of sense and assuming, like I don't even assume that I share a lot with the people that I love who are sitting right next to me sometimes. And I think that there's another way of going about it than just sort of try and find a common ground. But,
yeah. So just building off of that, and I just have a little bit to say about Bob's comment and then Daniel's comment, which I may have misread, but you'll tell me if I did. And it's something that I think about a lot. I think actually, you said culture of protest, Bob, and I think of it as a culture of critical inquiry and a culture of resistance and dissent. And actually, rather than closing the door when we say where we stand, I can say, oh, I think this, and these are just ideas that are out there, but I'm not locating myself in it. But once I locate myself in it, really it's an act of trust, and I'm trusting the people I'm saying where I stand to respond to that, right, respectfully. So I think it opens a door rather than closes the door. But I think there's also a way that we can, and this is partly, we actually do agree a lot. We agree a lot because we've worked at understanding the areas of difference. So I think to say where we stand opens a door rather than closes a door, but I think that false symmetry sometimes is, well, all ideas are equal, and we're all on the same side, and kind of racism's a big misunderstanding, or capitalism's a big misunderstanding, and sometimes we actually are on different sides, and we have different interests, and we ought to map that too, and then there's a struggle to be had. So that's how I see that. The thing that Daniel raises, what I thought about as you were raising that question about creating new disciplines, new canons perhaps, and when outsiders become insiders and when programs that start in protest end up being institutionalized, what happens? And I think this is a big problem within the academy and Black studies now. I think that the mode of critical resistance and engagement has been diluted in a lot of programs, and certainly it's true in gender and women's studies. And I see it breaks my heart in places like South Africa, where literally a protest movement on the outside becomes the insiders, and compromises are made that kind of eviscerates. And I guess what I'm reminded of and what I'm hopeful about in that is something that I take from Ella Baker, which is that she always said, I'm not committed to an organization, I'm committed to a movement. And that organizations can come and go, projects can come and go. I'm investing a lot of time and energy into the social justice initiative, but if it lasts forever, that's probably not a good thing. Right. Because the world changes and it becomes entrenched and ossified in a way that is not the vibrant thing that we're trying so hard to give birth to at this, at this moment. So if that's any upbeat response to the problem of institutionalization, then that's what we have to offer. But thank you all for coming to this panel. I don't want to dip into Lonnie Guinier's remarks. And let's all, be in touch. We're easy to find. So if you want to move to Chicago, we are always recruiting out there. And I think that the keynote's right around the corner. What time does it start?